Hi everyone. Sorry that I'm not facing the camera again today. I know I've been doing a lot of sort of off-camera videos recently, but every time I sit down to do a video I happen to be feeling quite tired and disheveled, so I just didn't really feel like facing the camera. But I also thought it might be handy to actually be looking at my altar for the Morrigan for this video, because I'm going to make a video or two now about the Morrigan and my relationship with her, and just a couple of different musings that I have been having about her and how I understand her and all of that good stuff. So for this video, I'm just going to concentrate on the Morrigan and her triple aspect. This is something that you will come across pretty much in even the shortest blurbs about the Morrigan will talk about her triple aspect, the fact that she sort of has three component parts. She has three different names, three different figures who are all part of the Morrigan. And this gets interpreted in various different ways. But the idea that she is three, that she is sort of three figures, three goddesses almost in one, is rarely disputed, I find, particularly in the pagan community, the New Age community, and those sort of circles. However, it is a little bit complicated because there isn't any consensus as to the three names of the Morrigan, as to which three figures exactly actually comprise the Morrigan. And people seem to have really largely just kind of gone with their own interpretation on this, and you really do have to just decide yourself. If you were going to go down the road of seeing the Morrigan as a triple aspect goddess, you really have to just kind of decide for yourself which three names you're going to use. So there are, I don't even know how many different names get associated with the Morrigan, to be honest with you. It's at least 5 or 6. Some of the main ones are obviously Morrigan itself, Badb is a main one, and Macha. Those two are very commonly associated with her. They're the ones that you will most often see. You also see references though to various other names being associated with her. There is Anu, which is a strange one, I think, but I'll get back to that. Danu even, which is even weirder. Anya I have seen associated with her. There is, of course, Nevin or Nemen. I would personally pronounce it Nevin. I'm pretty sure it would have always been Nevin, Nemain. And those are the main ones that I can think of now off the top of my head, but you do see an awful lot of names associated with her, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about each of those names a little bit, I think. Let's start with Badb. Badb essentially just means crow in Irish. She will often be described as a Badb Caha, a battle crow, or a kind of, what was it? I can't remember the other name for it, but essentially a hooded crow, a grey crow, which is a very common crow in Ireland. But yes, essentially Badb basically just means crow. Now this isn't to say that Badb is not an actual anthropomorphic figure, because Badb, I think, is definitely in some stories, Badb is described not only as a crow, but usually as a hag, as an old woman kind of hopping across the battlefield. That sort of nimble hag hopping over the dead bodies on the battlefield and sort of claiming the dead on the battlefield, I most often associate with Badb. Those two kind of images often go kind of hand in hand. So there is definitely no question but that Badb is associated with the Morrigan. You couldn't be sure if they were always the same persona or not. There is just very definitely an association made. There is an assumption in the texts that they are one and the same. And that Badb is the name or the figure that I will most readily associate with the Morrigan, that I have no problems kind of thinking of her as being basically an aspect of the Morrigan. The next one is Macha. This is a little bit more contested because Macha really only appears in a couple of mentions as being one of the Morrigan or the Morrigu. There are people who don't really see Macha as being a battle goddess, so they have difficulty associating her with the Morrigan. Macha is mostly kind of associated with childbirth. Her name actually means pasture. So she's very much associated with sort of fertility and the land and that sort of thing. The primary story about Macha that we have in the folklore shows her essentially being forced to race some horses and subsequently giving birth, while pregnant at the time, subsequently giving birth and then dying. And when that happens, she curses the men of Ulster who have forced her to do this, who've wrongly forced her to do this in order to save her husband's life. And then that kind of goes on and is an important part of the story of the Táin Bó Cúailnge. Basically, I don't have a problem seeing Macha as associated with the Morrigan. I definitely see her as being part of the fold, more than anything just because of the kind of feeling that I have from her, from the stories and so on and so forth. I have no problem also associating the ideas of fertility and the land and sovereignty with ideas of battle and death. I really don't see much of a problem there, because especially in Irish folklore, but just in general, obviously birth and death are inextricably linked. It's kind of hard to say where one ends and the other begins, because in order to keep the land fertile, the trees and animals die and they return to the soil and they fertilize the land, and it's this sort of cycle of life and death that allows kind of the land to remain fertile and all of that kind of thing. And then of course the pastures themselves, they become the battlefields. Those are the places where the battles are held. And then of course you have the strong association of sovereignty and ownership of the land and stuff like that, which very definitely links the sort of fertile farming kind of associations with Macha, with the sort of more warlike associations of the Morrigan. So I don't have a problem with her. Then we have Danu and Anu. And I really definitely don't understand why Danu has actually been associated with this at all. I believe that Anu is mentioned at least once, but Danu I think is just a confusion between the two, and they are very definitely two different names. There's definitely no particular link there, I don't think, anyway. I just don't see much reason for associating this name with the Morrigan, because there's very little in any of the folklore about Anu. There really is very little there. I have never felt a need to use that name for a name for the Morrigan. Then we also have Nevin, I mentioned. Nevin basically means frenzy or battle fury, and Nevin is another figure that I really haven't brought into the fold with the Morrigan, because, well, for various reasons. She kind of strikes me as just being another aspect of the Badb, and more than that, I often feel that really when they're saying Nevin, it's almost like they're just describing the battle fury of the Morrigan herself, and that it's not necessarily that they're describing a different person, or you know what I mean. Nevin herself, I seem to remember, is another pretty hard to pin down character. I don't actually remember any stories about her whatsoever. I'm sure she's mentioned as somebody's wife at some point, but any of those sort of family trees are kind of impossible to do with Irish folklore if you've ever really tried to delve into it in any serious way. It's absolutely chaotic, and there's no consistency to it whatsoever. So I've never really felt a need to bring her into the fold either, because like I say, I feel like that ground is kind of covered with Badb. I really see them as being the same kind of figure, or like I say, as being sort of the battle aspect of the Morrigan herself. So, oh yeah, and Anya, again, I have no idea how she got associated, no idea how she got thrown in there. I really have not seen very many sources referring to her in association with the Morrigan at all. I'm really not sure what that's about either, but if anyone can enlighten me on that, please do. I haven't actually read a huge amount of original texts. Obviously I've read a lot of Irish folklore, a lot of Irish mythology, and I have read one or two original texts, translations of original texts, but I haven't, obviously, because I'm not a scholar in Irish or folklore, I haven't actually delved into the sort of all the original glosses and where some of this information comes from. So basically the only names that I like to bring into the fold with the Morrigan are Morrigan herself, Badb and Macha. The way I come to see it is actually that the Morrigan is kind of, she is, I don't feel that she is necessarily on a par with Macha and Badb, that the three of them together create the Morrigan. The Morrigan is sort of at a slightly higher level than Badb or Macha for me. But then, I know I've talked about this before, and with the symbolism of the Russian doll, that you have sort of one archetype or god on the outside, and then the further you go in, you get kind of lower levels, more minute levels. And this is the way that I understand gods and goddesses, having sort of a wider archetype, and then contained within that you have many different faces of the same kind of figure. So Macha and Badb for me are, on one level, they are sort of like subsets of the Morrigan, and then on another level I actually kind of approach them as separate goddesses in and of themselves as well. So when I address Macha or Badb, I'm not really addressing them as the Morrigan. I'm not saying, oh, this is just another name that I'm using for the Morrigan. They are sort of separate entities. But I'm just kind of acknowledging that I'm addressing them all together as this one whole, which is the very complex archetype or goddess that is the Morrigan. So yeah, if that's not complicated enough for you. It took me a while to kind of get to this point, because I was so dissatisfied with the idea of actually acknowledging the Morrigan as a triple goddess at all. And really, while I do bring in the triple aspect a bit, like I say, I have started addressing the Morrigan as Morrigan, Macha and Badb. That being said, it's not a central component to her, and it's more that I feel like she has lots of different kind of shards and aspects that I can tap into and get in touch with, kind of separate from each other, rather than being this very sort of strict delineation of these three different equal parts of the Morrigan, if you see what I mean. I've really enjoyed, and if you're interested in learning more about Irish folklore and mythology, I would really suggest that you check out storyarchaeology.com.org. I can't remember, but I'll link it below. They have done some really excellent podcasts on both Macha and the Morrigan, actually, and they talked a bit. Now, their take on Macha is really that they don't associate her with the Morrigan at all, and this is because their interpretation of the Morrigan is that originally she was probably not a triple goddess at all. The way they see it is that one thing you need to know about the Irish mythology and folklore is that anything that we have is not actually that old. It's nowhere near as old as the stories are themselves. Anything we have was written down by monks between, well, some of it is quite old, but most of it is sort of from the 10th century at the earliest, but most of it's sort of the 12th, 13th century, if I remember correctly. So we're looking at probably at least 1,000 years before these stories were actually told or based. I mean, nobody really knows how old they are, really. So we're certainly looking at an era in which these figures were not being revered as gods anymore. These tales were kind of being set down as mythology that was considered to be sort of interesting folklore or historical kind of mythology by these monks. So a lot of what we get told is not necessarily what would have been understood at the time, or when these, like I say, when these figures were actually understood to be gods. There may have been very, very different conceptions of them at that time. And one of the things that the story archaeology, the two women on story archaeology point out is that these monks would have been very well versed in classical literature, and they often draw a parallel between the Morrigan and the Furies. So they actually often refer to Morrigan, I think they refer to the Morrigan as, I can't remember their names now, but one of the Furies. And basically they kind of thought, well, that these monks who were writing down these stories thought the Morrigan sounded like the Furies, and therefore there should be three of her because there are three Furies. And then that they were sort of almost scrounging around for other names, other names or faces to give these three aspects of the Morrigan. And this, to me, does actually make a fair amount of sense, which is why I've never felt completely comfortable with really getting on board with the triple aspect of the Morrigan in a really sort of set, concrete kind of way, that she is always three. That being said, I can see why it kind of fitted the Morrigan so well to have a more than one kind of parts to her, because she is slippery. She never appears the same twice. She appears in all of this folklore mythology with completely different guises and very, very different character, very different roles. She is just totally different from place to place. Sometimes I even wonder if there was one Morrigan at all, or if it's actually just a title, because Morrigan does mean great queen. I do sometimes wonder if it's actually really just a title or an essence, and that the Morrigan can kind of manifest in all of these different ways. I definitely feel that there is some basic Morrigan element, you know, that there is something there that is just purely Morrigan, that it's not just a name or a title. There is something more to it, but she is certainly very, very complicated. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that a bit, because I kind of avoided Macha and Badb for a long time, even though I was always really, really drawn to Badb. Badb, even more so than the Morrigan herself, has always been just hugely interesting to me. The Morrigan most often appears to me in the form of Badb. And yeah, but Macha had sort of been very on the outskirts for me until fairly recently. One last thing I will say before I go is that, and I really don't mean to insult anybody who gets on board with this, but I really quite severely dislike the whole Virgin Mother and Crone thing with goddesses, and I very definitely don't slot the Morrigan into those three archetypes. There was a time when I really enjoyed those archetypes, when I really enjoyed splitting or just, you know, looking at the divine feminine through those archetypes, or, you know, using those filters. But it's something that I've really moved away from, that I became quite uncomfortable with over time for various reasons. That might be another video in and of itself. But I definitely don't feel the Morrigan, to me anyhow, does not kind of fall neatly into those categories whatsoever. You know, you could definitely call Badb the crone. There's no, you know, major questions about that, but there's not a lot of virgin energy about the Morrigan, I will say that. She is incredibly queenly, and I would say that Macha also is quite motherly. There is definitely a very motherly aspect to Macha. But the Morrigan, if she is the third part of my triple Morrigan, the Morrigan herself is no virgin, like I say. She is no innocent. She is not young. The Morrigan as a whole has an incredibly ancient feel to her, and to call any out of her aspects of virgin would just really strike me as very counterintuitive. So I think that probably sums up the thoughts that I've been having recently about the triple aspect of the Morrigan and how I've been addressing her. It's all very much a work in progress. I work really, really, really slowly with deities. I have really never jumped off into the deep end. I always just feel it out really slowly. It's probably largely to do with what I believe about the gods, and what I don't believe about the gods and stuff like that. But it's a very gradual process for me, and building up my relationship with the Morrigan, I feel like I have barely taken the first step on a very, very long road. Even though I've been technically working with her on and off for the best part of 10 years, more than 10 years. It's really only been in the past just over a year that I've been working with her on a regular, kind of almost daily basis. Yeah, pretty much daily for over a year now. But like I say, first step on a very long road. She's so complex. Yeah, okay, I will leave it there. I'm going to make another video after this talking a little bit more about other things about the Morrigan. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, leave them below, and thanks for watching.